Introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, Craig, do you see my PowerPoint slide? Is it showing up on the screen right now?
It is. Good job. It is. Yep.
Okay. All right. All right. Fantastic. Let me do this for a second. Now I'm just gonna let me make sure that that worked. Hi everyone. My name is Alan Heisterkamp. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you some of the work I'm doing here just south of Ping. Actually, I am a 3-hour drive just straight down Interstate 35 and really close, Ping. So we need to have coffee sometime. Let's figure out how it's going to work. So thanks for this chance to share with some of the work here. My topic is going to focus on some of the prevention efforts happening in the secondary schools here in Iowa. I direct the Center for Violence Prevention here at UNI, whose sole purpose is to take these conversations and efforts to address men's violence against women, men's violence against men, all kinds of forms of oppression, and construct that in a way that is palatable and amenable to leadership in K-12 education and also into a certain degree higher ed. So one of the first questions I have is those of you who I can see the picture on the screen here, wave your hand if you have a son, a daughter, a niece, a nephew, a granddaughter, a grandson, or a grandchild who is in grades K through 12. Just give me a wave if you know somebody, have a family member who is in that age frame. This is an important topic, obviously. The better job that we can do at prevention and finding ways in which to gather the expertise of folks like you and others to partner with educators who have their own set of expertise and skills and marriage those in a way that allows youngsters to begin thinking about themselves in relationship to each other. We are going to have a decrease in all forms of gender-based violence and bullying as we go on. So I've prepared some slides for you to kind of walk you through, in a nutshell, some of the practices in the community here, which I'm affiliated. So allow me to do that right now. All right. So here I have kind of an overview for the session here for these next few moments. And Craig, confirm for me real quickly, we about a quarter after the hour to pause and maybe have a conversation. Yeah. Yep. All right.
Yeah,
perfect.
if you could do that, that'd be great.
All right. Thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about my own personal and professional trajectory that began. I remember the exact day in April of 1999. We'll share with you some of the gender violence prevention programming that is sprinkled in. And if you can imagine the analogy of a steady drip, a leaky faucet, that's kind of our approach to prevention, is that it becomes a part of the woodwork of the schools and organizations who serve youth and families here in Iowa. In 2007, I was a part of a project that was supported and funded by the Waite Institute for Violence Prevention in partnership with the Sioux City community, which included the K-12 school system. In 2011, the work had begun to demonstrate an opportunity to have a more grounded and rooted effort, a home base, if you will, which is now the Center for Violence Prevention at the University of Northern Iowa. I like to say that my classroom and my scope of work is really across the entire state with every potential school district and every agency who serves youth and families in those respective communities. And lastly, if time permitting, I'll share with a little bit about how the Iowa Men's Action Network actually began, and what are some of the practices that we are able to conduct here in Iowa, and also connecting the Iowa Men's Action Network to through the North American Men Engage, and also in partnership with the Global Men Engage. So here's some critical questions to consider as I share with you some of this work. But so how does gender violence prevention, or what does it look like and sound like in secondary schools? What strategies serve to build capacity around preempting and also preventing violence? What community agency and school district partnerships are you familiar with, and how does it work in your respective community? How might we measure shifts in thinking and ultimately climate within communities to build community? So those 4 questions I would invite you to consider, and also I will attempt to share reflections on, from my perspective, on those very same questions. So just again, a little bit of some awareness. Iowa, just south of Minnesota, and as I mentioned earlier, just a few hours south of Pang. But in Sioux City, Iowa is the community where South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa connect. It's a river city. It's on the Missouri River. It has a history steeped in agriculture, obviously. It was a large livestock station, the largest to the west of Chicago back in the day, in its prime, and has a large packing industry that has been, and railroad industry that has long been a staple, if you will, of that commerce and other businesses affiliated with those. So very blue collar, and a growing number of diversity, a growing amount of diversity happening over the course of the last 30 to 35 years. So to put this presentation a little bit into context, just to share a little bit about my background, coming from the standpoint of an educator in a K-12 system, my professional career started off as a mathematics teacher, and also doing some coaching, then continuing on some education into educational psychology and counseling, and was a school counselor in a high school for roughly 6 years, and then 12 years as a school administrator, which is where I began and intersected with this idea about large scale, really systematic prevention education in our school district. And Sioux City Schools, just as, again, some more context, roughly in the K-12, about 14,200 students. And we have a diverse group of students, 32 who identify as Hispanic, roughly 4% African American, Asian American, 3% Native American, roughly 18% English language learners in our school system, and almost 2/3, 60% of the students eligible for free and reduced lunch. So by Iowa standards, we're a pretty diverse community. Certainly the packing industry, the livestock industry had brought in, over the decades, has brought in workers from all around the world. And so we have always had, and as a teacher, a counselor, as an educator, had always been, I grew up professionally in an environment that was rich in diversity, and again, unlike the larger state of Iowa in its makeup. This was for me the turning point in my professional aspirations. As a school administrator at the time in 1999, I was looking to continue my professional career being a school administrator, then looking to a central office position, and I really had an interest in being a school leader, a superintendent of schools at some point in time in my career. It was when Columbine occurred where my attention and my thinking shifted, and was actually challenged to think a little bit differently about education in general. I remember standing in the office of our high school when news broke that morning in April about Columbine, and it certainly wasn't the first time that young men, male-identified individuals, had shot and fired off guns in schools, and it certainly has not been the last time. But this event was, I think, in terms of our nation's experience with violence and men perpetrating gun violence specifically, what made this so unique, as most of you will recall, was that it happened in Jefferson County, Colorado, a relatively middle to upper class community where, this sort of thing just didn't occur, right? And so I remember being in the office, and our phones in Sioux City, Iowa started to ring off the hook of parents wanting to call and dismiss their kids to come home because they were scared and concerned that there was going to be a ripple effect, if you will. This was a ground-shaking moment, and as educators then sat down with school boards and parents and law enforcement in the days after Columbine, as you can imagine, there were all kinds of conversations around school safety, gun violence. Very little was being talked or discussed about masculinity, toxic masculinity. These were words and phrases. These were phrases to me that were not that familiar. But as the conversations continue, there seemed to be a group of my peers who were advocating for more police presence in schools, metal detectors, more surveillance cameras. Their discussions and their conversations sounded more like we were building more of a correctional facility than we were an educational institution. It was a colleague of mine, Judy Stafford, who was currently working with Cindy Wade at the Wade Institute for Violence Prevention, who had been and was interested and had been working on a national scale with some national partners around violence, particularly men's violence. Judy approached me one day in a high school where I worked and introduced me to an approach that would get at some of the potential root causes of violence that are occurring in our community, not necessarily as grotesque as shots being fired and students and adults being killed in schools, but some of the antecedents or behaviors that could potentially lead up to those types of egregious acts of violence. What she was telling me was making so much sense. It was the beginning of then several conversations that took place from myself, who was working inside a school system, inside a school building of roughly 1,300, almost 1,400 students. Again, very diverse in student makeup, but what she was talking about made so much sense. So, make a long story short, this is where I was introduced to really the men's movement. This in early 2000, 2001, 2002, was introduced and to the work of a lot of the colleagues that are currently on this particular webinar, but are involved in NAMA, but also across the country in various ways of really examining masculinity and men's violence against women, men's violence against men. And this was an introduction to me as a professional. It made an incredible amount of sense, and I wanted to learn more and study more. And so, again, working educationally, my dissertation was really on male public school administrators and their thoughts and ideas and attitudes about these very topics. And so my interest was certainly supported by the Wade Institute, by the Sioux City School District where I work, and we began to find ways in which to start building capacity. We knew that if we were going to increase the likelihood that behaviors that not only get in the way of education, but healthy relationships and security and safety, is that we need to engage the students in this discussion. So while the adults from all sectors of our community came together, it was really the student leaders that were identified, that were really a cross-section of our student bodies. Those in partnership with the adults in the schools, we began to work together. They became the spokespersons for healthy relationships, for talking about unhealthy relationships, healthy masculinity, etc. And these conversations and structures were put in place. So with practice, with each other, we began to reconfigure how we were doing business in our schools to allow for time during the school day. This is instructional time during the school day, to call time out, to have these conversations. We used a scenario-based approach to talking about and understanding about behaviors, bullying and violence, gender-based violence being wrong, but more importantly, what do we as a school community, what do we as students in this building hope to achieve, and how do we want to interact and live in community with each other? And so it was hours of practice and dedication from groups of students who saw the validity in what we were doing. This was one of the only programs that I was aware of at the time that was, at least in Iowa, that was really seemed to be able to engage men or be more invitational to boys and men in that conversation, which was, again, for me, just coming into this work, it was obvious to me that women and girls have been having these concerns and these discussions for a long time, vis-a-vis the women's shelter movement, the leaders, and understanding the dynamics in the history and really finding ways in which to engage boys and men in this conversation. We were having success in doing that because primarily we were engaging, some of the men's leadership in our community and modeling, working in partnership with coalitions and other female identified leaders in our community. And so we knew that I knew educationally that we had a role to play. It's one thing to, how should I say this, having access to so many youth in our community is both a blessing, but also a challenge in which to find the amenable and palatable ways in which to engage youngsters, and then be communicative to the broader community, their parents, etc. And so what we knew, what I felt that as educators, that what we could do is we could really address those primary behaviors and attitudes and beliefs that, as we know, are the foundation and that support the more egregious behaviors. We weren't going to have students stop gun violence in its tracks. We weren't asking students to step in and to step in between two students who were disputing and had some type of physical altercation. We were asking students to pay attention to really the behaviors and the comments and attitudes that are at the bottom of this pyramid, and that's something that we could do. That's something that our students felt that they could do, because if we were better at paying attention to and then disrupting and finding ways in which to de-escalate situations to keep them from happening or moving more physically aggressive, etc., that we were going to really receive some really positive dividends down the road, and we did. So in fact, at the high school in which I was serving as a school administrator, we began to have these weekly discussions, and over a period of 5 years, from instituting this model and using a near peer approach and having these conversations with some fidelity, sticking to it, right? Despite the spikes in numbers, that we knew that if we stuck to this over time, our students were really convinced too that we were making some differences. Myself personally, every time I see this chart, I remember back in 2002 recording that very first dot there. 45 violent. It was a violent incident in our school, a physical aggressive behavior actually. There were 45 that first quarter, and if you know anything about the school year, 45 days is about one quarter. So there's about one incident a day that I, as a school administrator, was dealing with the aftermath, if you will, of some really aggressive behavior that was coming out of all kinds of stereotypes, attitudes, a lot of the posturing going on, primarily between young boys, but also with some young female students as well. But over time, we were able to demonstrate the effectiveness and the calmness with which our school ultimately began to live, and it was a different climate, a different feel to the school, and again, in part for really engaging with student leaders in that capacity. So this led to that really opened our eyes, and we wanted to be more intentional about what was happening in this one building, and we wanted to spread it to the other two large high schools in that same district at the time. And the Wade Institute was helpful in really kicking us off with this initiative. And here, these were our needles that we wanted to move. The question was how we were going to do it. We wanted to increase the number of adults who talk to kids about these issues, because that's an important strategy. But we wanted to increase the number of students who believe that these behaviors are wrong. We wanted to increase the number of students who are willing to intervene against it, and also to increase the number of youth who were likely to observe their friends also intervening. In other words, we wanted to build a culture and a climate where it was expected of everybody to identify and recognize that these behaviors aren't okay, but more importantly, what can I do as a friend, as a classmate, as a teammate? What can I do in multiple ways to respond? And over time, we should see an increase in through our data in our school and outside of our school with regards to some of our juvenile court services, and who we're already tracking the incidences of youth violence in the communities with thefts, with robberies, with assaults, drug use, et cetera, et cetera. We had been collecting that data as well. We knew that to reach to really reinforce the messages inside the community, we needed to really reach to the outside of the community. So we devised a series of, for 4 years, a variety of campaigns, if you will, where we blanketed the community. This is a community the size of about 120,000 in population. And so we partnered with signage companies. We put these slogans into our school programs for events, whether it be for a musical event or an athletic event. We were inundating our community and our school with these messages, and really challenging our community to think about, how do we stop domestic violence? How do we stop intimate partner abuse? And what's the role of men in that? Again, these are questions that we were posing to our broader community, and we were finding bus stops and buses and billboards, and it was it was very difficult to not navigate in our community and not see one of these public ed campaigns splattered across the community. And what we discovered through some research with Peter Hart research, doing some pre and post, is that it mattered. Folks paid attention to. They were just provocative enough to make them think about it. So, for example, in 4.5 months' time, from 31% to 45%, we were able to demonstrate through the research that there were more adults talking to their sons about violence against women, which was before this was not happening. This was a new discussion. This was a different discussion. And then looking at again, this is just some more data from the Peter Hart research, but 502 adult males who responded to this survey. And so we were showing that what we were practicing and reinforcing and teaching inside the school walls was having an impact on the broader community. And also at the same time, secondarily, was reinforcing to our student mentors that this work is important. So the signage met our expectations, and we really felt that those were valuable parts to our multi-systemic approach. Very specifically in terms of what we were measuring in terms of students themselves in grades 6 through 12. I mean, these are large numbers of students, and trying to collect some information on the masses as to can we budge their thinking, can we increase and expand their thinking, or I should say challenge their thinking as to the words they use, the music they listen to, spreading of gossip and rumors, the insults, the put downs to LGBTQ students. I mean, we were challenging and asking them all of these behaviors, and we found that in roughly 18 behaviors that we were measuring, that 50 to 65% of those behaviors, our students were saying to us, yeah, they're wrong. I'm willing to do something as opposed to nothing, and make the situation better. And not only that, is that I'm observing my other peers and friends and classmates and teammates doing the same thing. And so, just looking in terms of large numbers of students and how we're able to shift. And this one graph gives one demonstration of the different types of behaviors we were asking kids to consider. And both at the beginning and at the end of our, from 2009 to, in this case, 2011, we were shifting, we're moving those needles, and more students were, at least in our surveys, were observing other students, their friends, really taking action in some way, shape, or form. We were really excited by this information, how it was coming in, and how attitudes were shifting and aggressive behaviors were going down, that we wanted to compare what we were doing with another school on the opposite side of the state in Iowa, who had demographically had a very similar background and able to compare. And the Sioux City schools and the comparison school, again, on all but one factor, had some significant differences from the students as well. So we knew we were on to something. We knew we were showing some shift in thinking that was actually manifesting itself into fewer aggressive behaviors. And also, too, while we didn't differentiate the physical and the threats, or I should say some of the control behaviors that in terms of relationships for those students who were, in some of the stages and different stages of dating and interacting and with a intimate relationship, we were hearing and also being able to show that those behaviors, aggressive behaviors, were becoming less and less, because more students were not okay with seeing or hearing aggressive language or aggressive behaviors of a young man towards a young woman, for example. In essence, we were, without really having the intention, what we really demonstrated to ourselves and to others of why we were seeing, I think, some of the movement that we were, is because this multi-systemic, multi-partner approach, it really was a socio-ecological model that was materializing before our eyes, because we knew in our work together in the community that this was a community issue, that it wasn't a school issue. And so when we looked to see what we were doing at all those levels, it began to really kind of make sense to us as kind of drivers of the strategies, but also we felt much more unified as partners. It wasn't long after that, in 2011, that the White House came out with a report across the country. 94% of school districts had policies on bullying and harassment. Only 60% of school districts had a committee that was devoted to this as an issue for culture and climate, healthy relationships. Half the districts provided some prevention training, but only 35% of the districts across the country had systemic programming in place. And when they did, it was primarily into the elementary grades, not the secondary schools. We know parents also too. I see, I'm looking at my time here. I've got a quarter after. Let me just a couple more slides here. Parents sometimes are used by some of my colleagues in the educational system as barriers to good prevention education. Oh, they would say, Alan, my parents would never support conversations about dating relationships or sexual assault. We knew that wasn't probably the case, but we didn't have the empirical data to show for that. So we did a survey with almost 800 parents in one of the urban communities here in Iowa, and by the vast majority of parents really were supportive of schools helping to emphasize more about these very behaviors: dating violence, sexual violence, bullying, harassment against girls. So we knew parents who had students that were in secondary schools were supportive of this. And this is really important to answer this next question. And that is because when we look at this K-12 or K through 16 continuum for social emotional learning, across the board, almost in every state, almost in every elementary school, you will find more than likely programming that's implemented by the teacher leaders in those buildings and in partnership with community agencies. They'll talk about bullying prevention, character education. We've adopted those in most school systems across the country. What we haven't done a good job is making it systemic in terms of secondary schools, which is an unfortunate situation, because when those youngsters graduate from high school and head down the path of higher education or military or work, they're not necessarily going to be as skilled or as knowledgeable of some of the issues related to gender-based violence, knowing the risk and protective factors, and also this notion that we have a responsibility to ourselves and to our peers and our friends and our classmates and to everyone to be that supportive individual and to recognize oppressive language, abusive language, degrading language, innuendos, etc. when they occur. This gave birth to, and I'll close here, but this gave birth to the Center for Violence Prevention. Again, having some of the early success in Western Iowa, being able to expand and support, but not without being in partnership with agencies who, like in most states, have some amazing program, amazing staff, but find it challenging and difficult to get into school buildings or school systems and to be accepted in as a part of the social and emotional learning curriculum that we so desperately need. So it's these partners here in Iowa. Every state obviously has parallel groups and associations with them, but working to build community. So thinking about communities of practice is for myself here as the director of the center. The work of the center really is done in partnership with the folks who are on the ground, who are in communities, who have the expertise, have the materials, but need the time and some ability to connect with school folks. And that's kind of been where I've been able to kind of help build some partnerships and to do some of the work. So that's I think I'll stop right there, Craig. And this is just a slide here about the center, where, as I said earlier, the classroom, my classroom is across the state, and working, whether it's in higher ed, or whether it's in secondary schools, or working with community partners like the juvenile court service agencies, chiefs of police, who want to really become have a much more stronger positioning in prevention in their community. We've found some amazing partnerships that we're just beginning to cultivate, and it's just a great opportunity to have moving forward. But for us, it's all about building capacity and being inclusive and identifying leaders at all levels for the purpose of preventing all forms of gender-based violence. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think I'll pause right there.
A lot. It sort of felt like a 2-hour presentation packed into 25 minutes.
Sorry. I know how that.
I know that we have so much to say. It makes me want to have these community practice sessions longer or something. At any rate, I do have one question I want to pose to you, which is, and there's another one posted here I see, which is that have you had experience bringing this to new districts that you're not yourself involved in, like a training environment? And particularly, I'm curious about how schools that are more focused on test scores and performance than school climate, and moving them towards being motivated to attend to school climate.
Right. School districts are a lot like individuals that show up to your trainings or our trainings. They all come in at kind of different levels of awareness and readiness, if you will. And so that's kind of how we approach it. I will say this, that unfortunately, I get calls from superintendents of schools or board presidents after a sexual assault has taken place within the student body, after the fact, right, and which is, so
that's the key, one of the keys, yeah.
That is, but there have been schools that we're about at 12-13% of the schools modeling and implementing some variation of a near peer student or adult supervised but near peer approach in the high schools with success, who have done it just because it's the right thing to do and it's preventative in nature. And there are other schools that have had to go through some really serious situations. Not exactly like the recent documentary that came out, Audrey and Daisy, which really put the spotlight on this particular topic around secondary schools and sexual assault. But no different than the hunting grounds, which made the rounds to the video documentary to a lot of colleges. So
colleges, motivated some conversation.
It did, and some response.
So we have another question to Alan from the audience.
Yeah, Laxman had a couple of questions, I think. Laxman, do you want to ask them yourself?
Sure. Great work. I have heard about that before, but now I'm listening and I'm really happy about it. I was wondering especially on two things, and one was about the change measure you were looking at. Did you do any triangulation as relation to the experiences goals where the changes in terms of behavioral experiences they were experiencing from boys who were part of this work? And then also to the fact that, when it comes to working with boys and discussing about power, at least I come from Save the Children background, so I have faced a lot of challenges among parents who really don't want their sons to divert from stereotypical macho kind of culture, and they become quite a strong barrier in terms of allowing the kids to be mobilized. So wanted to listen to your experience.
Yeah, so thanks, Laxman. That's a great question. Let me start with the last one first. What we experienced is that we knew going into when we roll up to a school building and we pull in the community partners and we identify the faculty and the adults in the community, both male and female identified, inclusive of that community, that when we get to the point where we're training and working with these 17, 18-year-old students to become mentors to younger peers, that we know that they're going to be talking about and walking through examples and demonstrations of behaviors that we are saying are a form of gender-based violence. Now, how does it make us feel, and what are ways in which we can, as a community, address these issues? We know that there are some students, male and female, that are going to go home that night and might experience or witness the exact same behavior that we were talking about in our training. And so sometimes I think oftentimes it came up to the parents and some educators as to, Alan, we might be putting these kids in a situation that's really conflicting with a home situation or something personal to them. And I guess to that comment, my statement, my thinking has always been, well, if they're in that situation right now at home, this training, this training isn't going to change what's happening at home, but there's a possibility, there's an opportunity for this young person to be able to find some potential ally, resource, or a confidant, an adult maybe, that can help them walk through some of the the conflicting messages. Again, mixed messages are all over the place. They exist. I think what this process does, to answer your question, is it has helped young boys, talk about specifically about some of the gender stereotypes and all those things that restrict them or are perceived to restrict them. And like many of you experienced in your own trainings, there is a weight that's lifted off their shoulders. They become almost giddy to the fact that they don't have to walk around with this mask on anymore. And these are 14 and 15-year-old kids that are like understanding for the very first time that, it doesn't have to be like this. But yeah, no, there's challenges. We do this, and those of you who work with mixed groups, when we roll into a school or community again, and we start this work, we will have 250 female identified students want to be a mentor because they're not okay with what's been going on to women and girls as it relates to gender-based violence. And we'll have maybe 15 or 20 male identified students that will want to be a part of this. Again, we have to really work at recruiting and giving men permission, giving young boys permission to be a part of this conversation. I'll tell you one quick story about two young men in the Sioux City, one of the Sioux City high schools. There are 3 high schools, but last year we're doing a training. There was the African-American star quarterback who was one of the mentors, and he was co-facilitating or practicing a co-facilitation with a 6'1", blonde-haired, blue-eyed, very handsome, openly gay male. Those 2 young men were standing next to each other, facilitating one of their sessions in practice prior to going into their 20 freshman students. And I'm sitting there in the back of the classroom thinking to myself, you can't buy what I'm looking at here. You cannot buy that. And out of this work, what I've come to understand is that the youth, they get this. It doesn't take much to convince them, but they need your support. But they are amazing in their work, and they will grow up to be parts of, on this webinar someday. I mean, that they're so keenly, in tune with some of the inequalities that are really frustrating, and they don't know why we as adults don't get our act together more. That's what I kind of sense. So
It sounds really great. It's especially these moments of how the kids pick it up so readily. It's an important piece of news. So we're going to need to come to some closure here. I'm not quite sure how to do that easily. Peng, I wanted to ask you about dads and how that connects in your work, but we don't have time to get your answer to that question. I'll leave the chat open a little bit so people can ask further questions. Maybe we can respond in some other way to those. But this has been wonderful. I guess for closing comments of mine, I'd like to just say that this is very rich for me to hear this information. I yearn for more dialogue, and so this will be the kind of the watchword for future sessions to see how we can accomplish that. These are such deep and different presentations, So, Peng, is there anything you want to say in closing, since we haven't heard from you in a while?
Oh, I don't. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Definitely, we'll talk more.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And Alan, thanks everyone. We're going to close now, so it's time. And until next time, in 2 months, we'll have another community practice session. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.